From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Corey. Great show. His comments at the start of his show, fascinating to watch. I hope they get posted up soon at skynews.com.au. Specific shout out to everyone who's had a tough weekend weather-wise. Fires in Western Australia, the Peel region, we're thinking about you all the way through, as well as those that are still mopping up what is happening in Queensland. But first, let's talk about a bit of politics here. By the way, no sooks, no lefties tonight. You're going to love this Sunday night edition of Paul Murray Live. We deal with all the news and then sometimes sit back, have some adult conversation. As you know, the Prime Minister is the greatest of all time, according to himself or his media backers. He is, of course, from the Labor Party, which are the great champions of the workers. He even marched with workers and Anastasia Palaszczuk in the lead up to the last federal election in the May Day parade. He was, of course, on his way to becoming Prime Minister, so it was good to play a home game, low risk, rah-rah-rah for the union movement. But as you know, the reality is that there are plenty of people who this government have taken for granted, including the working class. Because you see, while yes, many people who swing a hammer are part of a union, there are an extreme number who aren't, including the people who've worked for building companies that have now gone kaput, the subbies, the people with the ABN, the sole traders, the small businesses that work for themselves. These too are the workers. There's plenty of the high-vis population that do not work for a big company, they work for themselves. And of course, this government does nothing to help them. Because you see, the cost of living remains the number one issue in the country. It is the one where we are punished every single day, and this government has got $20 billion in surplus and has done nothing to truly alleviate it. Instead, it plays for the history books that are not read by the workers, but instead the opinion that's formed by the big end of town, the fluffy parts of the media and the academia, who of course automatically declare that being a Labor Prime Minister, he's one of reform. He's not a controversial figure. Hence why, when faced with the choice of what to spend $450 million on, the Prime Minister decided to spend it on the Voice campaign. Now, even before we formally knew what the date was, even technically what the question was going to be, the polls started to show us that this thing was heading south. But no, $450 million had to be spent. And all day, every day, this was the advocacy. Remember, never forget the priority. The day after Israel was attacked on October the 7th, the Prime Minister wasn't in a synagogue, he was crying in the dirt of Uluru because the referendum was more important that weekend than showing support to his fellow citizens. And the receipts are now starting to come in about what we have known the whole time. Working class Australians are now starting to turn their back on the Labor Party. Now, they haven't made the full conversion to voting for the Liberal Party and wanting to change the government. They're now starting to talk about things like independence, minor parties, or anything but the Labor Party. But remember, the Labor Party, of course, is able to only have a third of the country vote for it, yet still form a majority government because of the preference system, which means virtually all votes of the Greens end up propping them up. Now, I think that as the time rolls on and the primary vote gets lower and the Greens vote gets higher, the chance of the Greens overtaking Labor in several inner city seats is going to be an issue. But also, it's working class base. And the working class base doesn't look like what most people who talk about a working class base actually looks like. As I say, it's more diverse, it's in the suburbs, and many of the working people who are screwed over by a government who doesn't care because they're not connected to the welfare system. Instead, the only way they get a pay rise is not going to the Fair Work Commission or arguing through the media. They literally have to get up an hour earlier and go to bed an hour later to fit one or two or three more jobs in before their day is done. And working class support is now starting to fall for the Labor Party. Redbridge, which is a polling organisation, leans very heavily left. Don't buy this garbage that it's a 50-50 one. It's a left-leaning poll. And yes, it concluded that if there was an election held today, because of those Greens preferences, Labor would probably get re-elected. But remember, there's plenty of other polls out there, including the Morgan poll, that say they won't get re-elected. Because you see, the working class, which are automatically relied upon to always vote Labor because that's what Dad did and that's what Grandpa did and that's what you should do. But again, the reality is that as we saw with the seat of Fowler, ethnically diverse in southwestern Sydney, they weren't going to put up with the Labor Party just throwing another person from Central Casting in as their local candidate. Instead, they went for a true local representative in Dai Lee. Now, of all of the things that happened on the night that they got power, that was one of the big signs about how they could lose a majority. And if they lose a majority, then we're off to the races. Let's see whether he has to form government with the Teals, with the Greens. All of that seems to be, at this case, the worst-case scenario for the government. There's not enough polling to suggest that they'd be a one-term government, but there's well and truly enough polling to tell us that they won't be anything more at this stage than a one-term majority government, and that'll be very bad for the country. One of the people who put this poll together from Redbridge said in the papers this weekend, the honeymoon is over for Anthony Albanese and he's now sleeping on the couch. The honeymoon suite phase well and truly over. The deafening sound of Australians being in love with this bloke because he had a special magical power is well and truly over, and they can see the reality of the priorities that he picks with his time, with his attention. The point also worth making here is that the only thing currently holding the dam back is the majority of voters don't believe the coalition's ready for government. So if this set of economic circumstances was there in the second or third term of a Labor government, we'd be beginning to talk about the end of that government. But because the Liberal Party has not, of course, been able to regenerate the number of people on its front bench, bring in a new collection of MPs and start to change its face from the government that was rejected about 18 months ago, the Prime Minister thinks that he'll be able to hold on to power, even in minority government, by just pointing at Peter Dutton, something that the media will more than well and truly help him with. But it is important to note again about priorities. And while this Prime Minister has unlocked many places in TAFE for people who want to become the next working class, the next tradie class of Australians, everything from hairdressers to builders and all in between, there is a relentless message because the Labor Party seems to believe that its future, while currently will be taking union money and taking workers for granted, they believe that a more educated population will always swing centre-left, and the first stop before you get to a Teal or a Green is the Labor Party, which is why the Prime Minister talks so often with a priority about university education. Pretty difficult to go through any of these institutions and come out anywhere near the middle, let alone conservative.
Additional university places. The university, go to university. Additional university places.
You see, that's their vision for the future. It's not that your kids should be on the tools, but they should be something with a degree. And not always degrees that lead towards vocational skills. It's why there are so many people, including myself, with arts degrees that don't really help when it comes to your employment. And of course, the university business model suggests that there should only be as many places in the classroom for the kids that are smart enough to go. But because we, the taxpayer, pay for it, it's every classroom, every seat can be filled regardless of whether somebody's smart enough to ride or not, because the government will pay for it. Of course, you don't have to pay back your university education until you start earning more than $50,000, and for many who either never get to that mark or just stay in some level of perpetual education, staying inside the indoctrination system, they never have to pay it back. And that's why almost $60 billion is currently being owed to Australian taxpayers by people who have not paid back their university fees. You see, if a company owed $60 billion worth of tax, the government would go after them. But if a student owes, collectively, $60 billion worth of tax, they won't go them because they know the most important thing that the university educated do is vote left. They vote Labor or they vote Greens and they preference Labor anyway. That's why they want everyone to have a university degree. It's not because they want thousands and thousands of philosophy majors. This week we will find out whether, again, the result of this government's decisions when it comes to a lack of doing anything about cost of living is going to be potentially another interest rate rise. All of the indicators are there. 2 months where inflation has started to go back up. Things like petrol, which are in the basket of goods, which they calculated on, is up more than 20% this month compared to about 15% last month, continuing to go up. And this was before we even started to price in issues to do with the world oil price. And while that may be the excuse for everything wrong with the economy, there was plenty wrong with the economy before Hamas decided to do what it did in Israel. Just like there was plenty wrong with the Australian economy under the Labor government before Russia decided to go after Ukraine. But apparently one of the reasons why there might be a pause in interest rates going up again is because Tuesday is Melbourne Cup Day. Now, of course, this would be irrelevant to the Reserve Bank, but Lots of people, they'll be getting their cans on, making the most of Victoria's public drunkenness laws that will now no longer be enforced. Compulsory voting is fine as long as we're having fun, bugger everyone else. Well, as I say, the Reserve Bank will be meeting on the same day. They will be announcing their decisions 30 minutes before the race that stops the nation. But the rate rise that could continue to stop a nation is a decision that we need to keep close eye on. Because, as I say, all the ingredients are there. Cost of living getting worse by the day, this government doing bugger all about it, especially the issue of petrol. I talk about it every night because it's an easy thing the government could do. It's not inflationary for them to cut your petrol price by 25 cents for 6 months. It costs them $3 billion. 50 cents for 6 months, that'll cost them $6. Or 25 cents for a whole year, again, costs them $6 billion. But they've already got a surplus of $20 billion, so they have the money to do it. But what happens if there is another interest rate rise, be it this month or in the lead up to Christmas? Well, thousands of people start to get in even deeper trouble when it comes to being able to pay off their own homes. Again, the reporting around this weekend, that more than 1 in 2 New South Wales households will be sitting squarely in the financial danger zone. Now, remember, when there was one interest rate rise under Scott Morrison, it was a cost of living crisis. If there's another one from the RBA, that's the Albo dozen, 12 that have happened on him and Grim Jim's watch. The exclusive analysis from Digital Finance Analytics say 55% of New South Wales households with a mortgage will be in the red if it's raised by just 0.25%. Nationally, the numbers are pretty much the same. 201,000 more Australian households will slip into a precarious financial position of mortgage stress, so that budgets of 2.1 million of the 3.8 million homes, or 55%, will be in the red. Because that's the calculation on what percentage of money that you have each and every fortnight or every month from your pay that goes on paying off your house. Once that starts to get above 30%, let alone 40%, let alone 50%, your capacity to pay for everything inside the house, including your family, well, it starts to evaporate, let alone the petrol for the car that may well be in the garage. But the Prime Minister, of course, will be doing nothing about that this week. Why? Because he's in China, rewriting history that he's the one who was able to save us from the economic coercion clutches of China, when, of course, it's China giving the Prime Minister and political party it prefers more preferential treatment because they don't want an inquiry into COVID. Remember, they don't even want one here in Australia that looks into what Labor state governments did. So Albanese is going to be no threat to China, but watch all of the media clap him on that somehow he's the great diplomat that 50 years on from Whitlam, blah, blah, blah. But another thing that is happening on this Prime Minister's watch that scarily few people actually talk about is the Australian dollar. Now, I keep mentioning this because I want to remind people about how this is an indice. Now, remember, when it was $1 or $2, the Prime Minister standing there holding a coin in the lead up to the last election because that was the minimum wage rise and just $1 this and just $1 this. Well, guess what the value of that dollar is on his watch? When he wasn't the Prime Minister, it was 78 US cents. Today, it's 65 US cents. It's gone down by a significant margin, 13 cents. It was 14 cents when we last checked last week. Now, of course, the result in that means that if the Australian dollar keeps going down, yeah, it's frustrating if currently you're doing your best in the United States or, God forbid, even trying to travel around Europe. But even more importantly, the reality of the crumbling Australian dollar is that everything that we import to the country costs more. And as everything to the country costs more, that adds into the basket of goods that are inflation. Clothes, insurance products, which are here in Australia, unaffected by that, but white goods, all the rest of it. The stuff you buy at the shops that's all made somewhere else, most likely in China. Well, all of that gets more expensive if the Australian dollar is worth less than it was back in 2021 or when the Prime Minister became the boss in 2022, and it's dramatically lower. So everything that's already costing more because of all the global things is costing 10% on top of that because of the faith the money markets have in the Australian federal government's way of doing things. Oh, and on top of all of that, expectations are that the global economy is now facing some of its toughest times since the 1930s. So we're talking about the lead into World War II, not the global financial crisis, not the Asian financial crisis, not even the COVID pandemic. The world is apparently financially on its way to where we were in the lead up to World War II. Do you trust Grim Jim to be a participant, to be the one who's going to be saving us from these global shocks where the Australian dollar gets weaker? Do you accept Albanomics that says we should have budget deficits for the next 40 years? And that it's not important whether your kids have a trade or not, it's important that they have a university degree because you'll keep electing lefties like him to power, and ultimately that's what they want. Now, one of the reasons why the polling is going the way that it does is because of the priorities of this government. I repeat for the 900th time, why won't they axe petrol tax? Tomorrow when you fill up, tomorrow when you drive past, have a look at that price. Now, if it's over $2, that's already going to shock you, but that's now becoming the new normal. 25 cents of that they could save you tomorrow with a stroke of a pen. But of course they choose not to do it, and they choose not to do it deliberately. Why? Who knows? But do you trust them to know? No, not really. Airbus Albo makes another stop off, this time in China. As we speak, he's on his way to Beijing. Tomorrow's when he has the big meeting with the boss of China to pretend that he's going to talk about human rights, but remind them that Australia doesn't have a ban on slave labour being used to build the 20,000 solar panels that his government demands we have to put all over the country, because it's oh so important that we deal with climate change when we're 1% of the world's problem as opposed to China, which is more than, what, about 30% of the world's problem right now? Of course, all of the media are not allowed to ask questions. See, they're well trained, these puppies. They're behaving like Toto, just in a suit, standing up on two legs, but they won't ask a question about domestic issues, because if he does that, the Prime Minister won't answer, and apparently that's an okay standard. As if he just got off a ship from 3 months to get there. No, he's on his own private jet, and I'm pretty sure they've got the technology that he could remain looking at the internet the whole time, let alone his ability to be across everything, no matter where he is in the world. But the Prime Minister, again, is pretending that what you're going to see in the next couple of days is vitally important, and it's only happening because of him, as opposed to it's only happening because he's not the type of government that China doesn't like. And what government doesn't China like? One that stands up to them.
It is in Australia's interest to have a positive and constructive and open and respectful dialogue with our major trading partner. And that's what I hope to achieve over coming days.
And just when you thought the travel was over, because the peak of it all is to go from the White House with Joe Biden, then, of course, to Beijing, and then he'll come back home and tell us he cares about cost of living, while not cutting petrol taxes, while not helping small businesses, all the things we've shown you on this program over how many times. Oh no, there's still two more trips to come. Phil Curry writing about the political consequence of Airbus Albo and how that as a term is starting to catch on. Just over a week later, Albanese will be back in the US, this time for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, which will be in San Francisco, where, by the way, expected to be there, the US and China. So we could have had meetings with the US and China all in the one trip. But no, we had to have a separate one in China, a separate one in Washington, and then the family photo in the US. He'll then go to the Pacific Islands Forum, and that APEC thing will end up being his 20th trip as Prime Minister. A point made today by Peter Dutton.
I feel a great frustration because the Prime Minister's been hanging out on red carpet and travelling the world and dealing with elites and the union bosses and the industry super bosses. We've been out talking to Australians in cafes, in suburbs and towns. There is a lot of pain out there that I don't think the Prime Minister understands, and he needs to get cracking to provide some support.
Now, while Australians, according to these polls, and that Redbridge one in particular, have not made the transition to say that they want to change the government and therefore Peter Dutton would become the Prime Minister, just three quick things to remember. He was right about the Jobs Summit being just a giant excuse to give the big unions what they want. He was right about The Voice because, of course, $450 million and Australians all ended up on the opposite side of where the Prime Minister was. And he's, of course, been right when it comes to things like the mass immigration, which is coming to Australia, where, again, as I mentioned last week, I don't care what you look like, what you believe in terms of a God, but certainly I believe that multiculturalism should be replaced with some sense that this is a better joint than anywhere else in the world, and that the laws of this country supersede whatever faith you have. But I've got something more on that in a second. But you know the whole tactic of the Canberra Press Gallery is to do the government's bidding, which is to get Dutton, to turn up the noise. This is what they did to Trump, this is what they did to Morrison, and this is now what they're going to try to do to Dutton. You see, because he is on the right side of some very big issues at the moment, the government and the gallery won't let the alternative Prime Minister start to fortify that relationship with the Australian people. And God forbid that if he voted for the Liberal or National Party at the next election, or at least preferenced them after voting for another minor party, Jacinta Price, of course, the lady on the right of your screen, would become the Indigenous Affairs Minister. One of the biggest reasons alone to change the government. Well, she's there and she's ready to go. But as you know, the mission is get Dutton, which is why so often the poison that falls from their lips is a D word that they're trying to turn into a swear word.
Saying Peter Dutton.
Peter Dutton.
Peter Dutton.
Peter Dutton.
Which is why the Prime Minister, as we told you last week, in the middle of the cost of living priority of the government, which of course was rubbish, they just said it a lot in speeches, started up a new dirt unit that was going to dig up everything they possibly could to reinforce the idea there was something dangerous about Peter Dutton becoming Prime Minister. Now, of course, there's already been a dirt unit up and running in the eastern suburbs of Sydney for some time, and it's done all that it can to dig up on Peter Dutton, and it's been summarily unsuccessful. But the people who were more than happy to turn up the noise on Morrison, the ones who, like in America, would turn up the noise on Trump, are the ones that are getting ready to do so to Dutton. We're talking here about self-admitted liar, nasty Nikki Sava, Peter Harcher, who, of course, is more than happy to throw some hate around as well, and Laura Tingle, well, she'll do it on the taxpayers' dollar for you on Channel 2 each and every night at 7:30. But the message while the boss was away to his chief leadership rival, but of course she won't become the leader of the Labor Party while Albo's still around because they're on the same faction and Albo would be able to see her coming, is Tanya Plibersek. And Tanya Plibersek's job this weekend at the Labor Party conference in Western Australia was to get Dutton. Don't talk about the failures when it comes to cost of living. No, let's just pretend you have to vote Labor because, firstly, you went to university, which makes you smarter than all of those other idiots. And of course, you have to re-elect the Labor government, no matter how bad it is, because of how evil Peter Dutton is. The Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, has launched a deeply personal attack on Peter Dutton. Remember, she had to apologise in the past, by the way, for some of the stuff that she's said about the Leader of the Opposition, saying that he's a man whose life mission is to block progress, stoke division and kick the underdog when they're down. Sorry, examples, please? Direct quotes. It's always the poisonous politics of no. You see, that's the other thing, right? That when you have a bad idea and the opposition doesn't support you on the bad idea, then it's all about the politics of no. Which, I don't know, I'd be doubling down on that name. Remember, of no, 60% of the country was with Peter Dutton on that one. A politics that says you can destroy and corrode, can only tear things down, never build things up. And this is the thread that runs through Peter Dutton's entire career in public. This man is the man who boycotted Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations. He's apologised for it, but of course it's only Labor politicians that get a redo. These are the positions of a certain kind of politician, one who sees weakness in empathy, power in negativity, political advantage in division, because you see, it's division when you don't agree with the government. That's why, of course, the division is fuelled by misinformation, so we need to censor the internet. I don't even understand how lefties are cheering that on, but alas, they are. A man who seeks to reach the highest position in Australian government by killing people's faith in government. What, by controlling the borders and having a clear sense of national security? A guy who understands borders, language and culture. Australians want our leaders to act constructively. Oh yeah, because this one's just really holding everyone together, isn't he? Now, of course, as I've spoken about many times before, this new model of politics that's currently being put together by chiefly Daniel Andrews in Victoria, Palaszczuk in Queensland, and now is going to try to go national, is the idea that you're able to basically get about 2/3 of the Australian public if they either literally work for the government and therefore the Liberals will cut the number of jobs, despite how unnecessary some of those jobs may end up being. If you're in business, your biggest client is government, so you don't want to upset the apple cart. Or more than half of your citizens have their hand out for welfare, no matter how over the top or relentless that can be. Remember, 35%, the single biggest amount of money that is spent in the federal budget every year, which is growing under Jim Chalmers, is welfare. So those that are completely self-sufficient, that don't need government, that don't work for it, that don't interact with it, well, of course, they end up being a little sliver that you can just ignore. Hence why places like the ACT give the government exactly what it wants, because the biggest industry in the ACT is working for the government. Well, did you know how many public servants we actually have in Australia? At the local, state and Commonwealth level, how's this? 2.1 million. 2.1 million people work for the government. Now, yes, there's some teachers and police officers, but there's plenty of pen pushers. Plenty of people who my mate Gary Hardgrave used to talk about as the people walking around with the clipboard saying no. Total cost of this, by the way, to you as the state, federal or local taxpayer, $194 for billion. 194 billion dollars, or a little bit under half a voice referendum. Now, 254,000 of that 2.1 million do work for the Commonwealth Government. And an awful lot of those are currently working from home. And guess what the union movement wants? More money for people to be staying at home. We learned today via the Australian newspaper that there are plenty of problems with the public service and huge sections of it who have no plan to leave the house any time at all. Meantime, Joel Fitzgibbon, who worked, of course, as a former Defence Minister of the country and as the Agriculture Minister, a shadow Agriculture Minister as well, well-known, Labor and Labor right, but he pulled out before Albo got in charge because he knew the madness that was coming. Well, he has seen the problem that is, frankly, the permanent state of overly progressive people who are paid more than other members of society to tell you what to do. And he says, as the former Agriculture and Defence Minister, the Voice to Parliament referendum result, which showed the ACT was the only jurisdiction that voted yes, showed the views held within that electorate were dominated by the public service, were not aligned with most of the country. He spoke at a meat industry function, because he's involved in a lot of that stuff, as well as the timber industry right now. He's a good bloke. I like Joel Fitzgibbon. Well, he says that the increased reliance that ministers put on the advice of bureaucrats means it can lead to poor outcomes. Why? Because, quote, our public service in Canberra is increasingly not being infiltrated but joined by increasingly progressive people from the ACT. I see what happens on a daily basis. For some people, that's a wonderful thing. We're a more progressive society, more conscious about the natural environment, climate change, and all those things. But there's a risk, given how dependent the ministers are, when it comes to the advice that they are going to be led around, and the pendulum is going to swing too far. Something that he sees happening daily. We don't make it up as we go along, we follow the receipts. I don't have faith in this government because of their actions, their decisions, their priorities. I know you're the same, and I'm pleased to see some people are starting to tell it to a pollster. It's up to the coalition to turn around to show itself to be an alternative government, not just to point about cost of living, but to have some ideas about what to do with cost of living. And OK, worst case scenario, the government will rip you off. Because I don't want this Liberal Party to end up where the Republicans are in the United States, where they're very good at defining a problem, but they don't offer a solution to it. Because, yes, the political system often will reward oppositions by just pointing out how bad a government is, but guess what? Every now and then there can be an idea bold enough to move people to say, you know what? I know that you know what the problem is, but I also trust what some of your solutions may be. That's what the fight will get involved in each and every night. No sooks, no lefties for the rest of the show. Let's get into it after the break here on Paul Murray Live. Thanks for watching. I said no sooks, no lefties. Doesn't get better than this. How's this? The delightful Bromwell Bishop in the man cave. Michael Kroger joining us from Melbourne. And Christmas comes early in the Ashby household. We've commented on this before, but can we take the wide shot? Like, what are we, first week of November? He actually had that up even earlier, but he's ready and rocking and he's off and ready. Do you have the Christmas music playing? Because I know there's a bunch of digital radio stations that are punching that out now.
Oh, mate, it's Mariah and Elvis all the way, yeah. All right.
Well, yeah, from Blue Hawaii and Blue Christmas, let's talk about blue collar workers. Where this poll suggests that there is a little bit of a move on. again, I don't want to misrepresent what it all was. They suggest that there's not the full move to the want to change the government, but the beginnings of it are there. Now, also, I think that one of the big problems about Albanese and Labor generally going into this next federal election, I think, is going to be people like Di Lee. Will other communities in Western Sydney or suburban Melbourne find a local representative who looks like them, as opposed to the person from Central Casting who's just always the Labor person? Because I think that there are many threats, many potential threats to the majority of this government.
Well, I think there are too. But the phenomenon of the people of the west of Sydney described as that is something that's been going on for a long time. I mean, when I was president of the party, that's 1985, I established an office in Parramatta because I knew that that's where hope, aspiration, real go really was. And when I became a senator, that's where I put my office, the first senator to move out of the CBD.
Wow.
And I treated that whole area as if it was my personal electorate, all 1 million of it. Now, that was because I believed then, I still believe now, that that's where there's a real generation of energy, of wanting to do things, of get ahead. And they're the sort of people that, in my view, I've always wanted to talk to as a Liberal, because they're the people who believe in free enterprise, who know that the individual has a right to aspire and to achieve, do the very best they can. So none of that is new to me. But for the Labor Party, they've got a real problem because they only ever get elected on Green preferences and now being backed up by the Greens. Their base is eroding and eroding badly. And that, hence, Di Lee was a good example. She was a good Liberal. I wish we'd had her in...
Yes.
Well, that's another story, but she's an excellent person. So, yes, there are going to be changes, but I just want to make this point. In Mackellar, where we copped a teal in the referendum, because we're a group of us who put in hard work and talked about the issues to the people, that result is 50-50. And that means that she's vulnerable. And the way she voted in the Senate supporting the Greens and the anti-Israel vote, that's where the effort has to be put.
Well, again, Michael, I mean, you see with people like Dr. Ryan, the rest of these teals, and again, I think that there is a dimension of the electorate that's gone forever, but there's always opening opportunities. But there's also generational issues too, where the Liberal Party does not have the connections into migrant communities that the Labor Party may well have. What are your thoughts here again about the poll? Do you believe that the working class change is on? Or again, because this poll, great headline, good bit of detail, but there's no raw report to go back to actually look at it. And the fine print still said that the government would be returned on preferences.
So, mate, Reagan famously once said, always dance with the one that brung you. And we knew Kevin Rudd was in trouble 6 months after he was elected in 2008, if you remember, when he went to visit Kate Blanchett in hospital to see the new baby instead of going to John Button's funeral. And that told you that that was his Marie Antoinette let them eat cake moment. He jumped from being a man of the people. He became part of the glitterati, the Hollywood elite. Kevin Rudd had forgotten those that got him where he was. And I think in many respects, Albo is looking the same type of person. You don't get the impression that Albo is there for the working middle class. I don't criticise his overseas trips because I think Australian leaders need to go overseas. But this whole year-long voice campaign where really nothing else mattered, and all he wanted to do was to be photographed with celebrities and football players and company heads, and you know, he was part of the actors and actresses. He was part of the glitterati. And he's lost touch with the ordinary working Australian. So I think that movie's on. And the other thing is, as Bronnie started to say, and I was at that office opening in 1985, I remember, by the way, Bronwyn. Don't tell anyone, it was a while ago. Mate, the Liberal Party has a long way to go in reaching out to the multicultural communities. I've tried to do some work in this area. When I was president last, it is difficult for all sorts of reasons. But if you want to look at how the Liberal Party can succeed, you look at Jason Wood, the Liberal member for Latrobe. whose relations with the multicultural communities are second to none in this country, and he had a 3% swing to him at the election when there was a swing against us all across the country and in Victoria, mate.
Yeah, also important here too to note, James, that again, working class, I always sort of like that working class does not mean they're heavily unionised. Working class often means the people who've got an ABN, the people who've got everything from the lawn mowing run to the hairdressing job, the person who's the subby, all of these people, yet again, we just don't talk about it. And as we presented earlier in the show, you can see what the preference is of the Labor Party, going back to Kim Beazley in terms of modern politics, university, because they know that once you've gone through it, sure, you mightn't actually pay back, what is it, $60 billion that are back to us. And I know I got my millions and billions mixed up with the cost of the public service, way more than multiple times, of course, what the Voice was. What about $190-something billion worth of the public service? That what they're trying to build here is a coalition of dependents, and the people who are the working class, the ones who are away from government, the ones who don't need government in their pocket all day, every day, well, they're not part of the model, are they?
Well, you're right to point out about the HECS debts. It's one of the biggest debt owed to government that's been allowed to just fester over decades now. And we've got plenty of people out there with great pieces of paper that says they've gone through 4 years of university and can do all these wonderful things, but they can't get jobs, Paul. Mm-hmm. And so those pieces of paper become worthless. So the dream that has been sold to them by be university lecturers or high school teachers, or the Labor Party for that matter, goes down the chute, and in the end, we never get that money back. Albanese's sort of sitting quite comfortably at the moment. If you have a look at his track record in this term of government, what he's done very cleverly, he's lent on those teals. So he's got 7 additional seats that he can fall back on if he loses any further seats across those city regions, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria. So he can lean on the Teals because he's been allowing them to make amendments right throughout this term of government.
And the Sydney Teals would absolutely back a Labor government.
Oh, sure. And this is what he knows. So he can afford to lose a couple of other seats in other regions because he'll pick up those 7 if they can hold on to their seats. Then he's got Andrew Wilkie in Tassie. Then you've probably got a Liberal defector from Tassie that'll probably go and help him as well. So there's a number of things that Albanese has cleverly crafted. What's interesting, though, is whether he can maintain government and support in the Senate. And he's only doing that at the moment with the likes of David Pocock and Jackie Lambie and the Greens. So it's going to be a very interesting next 18 months.
Yeah, but I tell you what, look, I'm not going to bet the house on it yet, but I'm beginning to write the ticket, which of course is Don Farrell doubles the number of senators from the territories. That increases the number of Greens and Labor in the ACT, kind of level out of what happens in the Northern Territory. But that too, the cushions that'll here, there and everywhere. Because rather than helping the people, it's about helping themselves, as he showed with who he sent off to the trade mission in San Francisco. The former Labor mate didn't even apply for the job. Oh, but we can't ask any questions about that because it's all about China right now. And what about the Chinese official speaking in Shanghai today? Australia was basically at a giant trade fair begging for tourism and business and Chinese investment. This is what the Chinese official had to say about how China's always right. This is the current format that the Prime Minister is about to go into. Have a look.
China will always stand on the right side of history, Premier Li Qiang said, opening an import summit. We resolutely oppose protectionism.
Okay, now, of course, we could spend the rest of the show unpicking why that is complete and utter garbage. But, Bronwyn, let's forward look to the next 24 hours. Because the media doesn't talk about domestic while they're overseas, it's just there to basically build the hagiography of the great leader. We should remind people, by the way, that in a meeting with translators, you talk for 50%, they talk for 50%, translators speak for the other 50%, so you're only actually talking about 25% of the time. So when you hear a 3-hour meeting, that's what it's really about. But the spin that's going to come out of this, that he's the great Thora in relations, China's a bully, and they got what they wanted, which was for him to be the Prime Minister.
Exactly. And he's already kowtowed. The decision about Darwin.
Yes.
The decision about pulling out of the World Trade Organisation complaints that we were making. There's a whole raft of things that he is weak on with regard to China, where he has paved the way for an invitation to dinner yet again. I mean, the Australian people realise that leaders have to travel, that they do have to go to certain meetings. But this Prime Minister is just, I think, stretching their patience too far.
We could have seen Biden, Xi and APEC all one trip, right? San Francisco next couple of weeks instead.
Correct.
Bespoke visit to China, bespoke
Correct.
visit to US and a second trip back there.
And describes at an official dinner in the White House as a great date night.
It's a date night.
I mean, seriously.
Yeah, good point.
I mean, we've got to the stage where yes, we're going to see trade relations back in certain commodities, but we had diversified in the interim, and it's very important that we don't pull out of those other markets and put it back into China, because we then become dependent again and liable to exactly the same sort of treatment again. So it's great that we have the ability to sell our wares, but the interesting thing was, even while those boycotts of certain products were in place from China, the size of the trade grew.
Yes.
So it's nothing to do with this sudden trip over there to say, look, aren't I great? What it is more to do with is how clever some of our own people are at finding the market, because China is in bad shape economically. It needs what we've got. So we don't have to give way like we did with Darwin. We don't have to give way on other issues. They need what we've got.
And remember, part of the mix here too, James, is as I go back to that point about the Australian dollar and now worth more than 10% less than it was before they came to office. Again, great for the exporters, and the government cares about the export because they clip the ticket on the way in. But for everything that gets imported from China, it costs 10% more. Inflation, inflation, inflation. But I mean, honestly, I'm going to really not talk about it much tomorrow night, just because you can see the reporting now about the great moments in history as Albo stands there with the boss of China. Please.
Well, these trips are distractions, Paul, because that's all this Labor government have, are distractions, and they're deliberately doing it. Look, they throw the media pack on the back of that Airbus, and they then have them for whatever the flight time might be. It could be as 18, 24, whatever hours, to then go and press the flesh with the media and make sure that the messaging's on point when they land. So these are distractions. Albo needs to get back here and deal with the real issues that we, as everyday citizens, are having to put up with. The only thing I'm happy to see China come and visit Australia for tourism purposes is because we've got $360 billion worth of submarines to pay for. So hopefully a bit of that tourism dollar will go towards our defence strategy, where
China's tourists
we're protecting
pay
ourselves from China
for us to pay the American government. Yeah, it's an interesting swing. All right, 30 seconds here, Michael. You'll decode the next 24 hours for me.
Well, look, I think it is important for Australian leaders to go overseas. He has some very important issues in relation to trade to deal with in China. So, as I said, I'm not a critic of our leaders going overseas. You take the lobster trade, for example. Now, we are one of the most important lobster-producing countries in the world, one of the very few, particularly in the southern part of South Australia. There was an enormous lobster trade into China before the ban took place, and then, of course, it had to go through the grey market, so they had to take our lobsters through Hanoi into Hong Kong, for example. That devastated a lot of people in that industry. I think there are important issues for a Prime Minister to discuss with the Chinese. I take Bronwyn's points, but they're a very difficult country to deal with, and I'm not going to sit here in judgment when our leaders are trying to do the right thing over there, and I'm sure he's acting in Australia's interests, and as he did in America, and that's been a long tradition of Australian Prime Ministers, Liberal or Labor.
News poll has just dropped, and for the first time, more people disapprove of the Prime Minister's leadership than approve. Surprise there. Two-party preferred getting tighter, 52-48. So again, nowhere near where Morgan was, where it was just above 50% in favour of the LNP. As for the primary vote, the Labor Party at 35, the LNP at 37, which is down 1 for Labor, up 2. Greens at 12, One Nation at 6. And in terms of Peter Dutton, again, again. His position, his approval level is 37 to disapprove 50, but it's starting to move in the direction of approval. But the headline, for the first time in his prime ministership, more people disapproving than approving. It's almost like we've been right the whole time. And that's why you're watching. I appreciate it. More on it back here in a second here on Paul Murray Live, including the line between free speech and hate speech. No sooks, no lefties. Less than 10 minutes away from the Royal Report. Michael Kroger is here with James Ashby and, of course, the reigning champ, Bronwyn Bishop. So there was a person who gave a lecture, a speech, it's a hate speech, at a Muslim community in Western Sydney. This stuff is going to be distressing content. It's difficult to listen to. Police are apparently now investigating, but the media reporting is we don't know what this person's name is, but his message is about as dark as it gets.
If the Australian government like it or not, if the ASIO likes it or not, if they want to deport me from Australia or not, the jihad is the solution for the ummah. Their hearts are aching for jihad. They can't wait to be amongst the mujahideen and die in the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Michael, of course, radical extremist language. It's all about the want to establish an Islamic state where, put simply, you live under Sharia law. Unless you convert, you die. And obviously the context of what's happening right now in Israel and Palestine. Again, I don't know this bloke's citizenship status, but if it's a possibility to get him out of the joint, I want to hear from Claire O'Neill tomorrow that process has begun.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, that is hate speech. That is an incitement to violence, calling for jihad. Presumably he's talking about jihad in Australia. We've only seen an excerpt, not his whole speech. If he's calling for jihad here, then he's calling for the violent overthrow of the Australian government. He should be, if he's not an Australian citizen, deported. And if he's an Australian citizen, then of course he should be charged with hate speech. One rejoinder to something we were discussing a week or so ago, it's now clear that the New South Wales Police under Premier Minns have charged 11 people arising out of things that were said and done at that neo-Nazi rally in Sydney on the 9th of October where they were yelling, "Gas the Jews." I hope some of those 11 have been charged with using those words. And I heard Chris Minns give a speech last week at a dinner in Sydney and on Israel. I must say, I pay credit to Minns. He gave a very good speech. He's been very good on this issue. And if there's any way the police force are acting under direction of his minister, well and good, because they've started well in charging 11 people at least.
But Bronwyn, what about the balls, not just to say it, to film it, and it's freely available on the internet?
Well, the fact is this, Michael was quite right to call him neo-Nazi, because the thing that bound the Axis together in World War II, and it included a percentage of the Arab community, was the hatred of Jews and the wish to kill Jews. This isn't hate speech. Hate speech to me is something that is when someone's slinging off at somebody. This is vile contempt for the nation. It's a vile contempt for the human race. And I just reiterate those statements that have been made, that if he's not out of the country, if he's not a citizen, quick smart, I want to know why, but something has to be done about that. It cannot be allowed to stand. That is an incitement to commit violence, to commit murder. And that is not something that we will have in this country. You know, there's an old Bohemian saying, you invite cannibals into your house, don't be surprised if your children go missing. Yeah. And that sort of behaviour is just not permitted in this country. I've got 30 seconds left on the clock, so it's fast and bumper sticker from everyone. Give me a bold prediction for the week ahead, James Ashby.
Interest rates will go up, and I think there'll be a huge cancellation of contracts, particularly on cars. Interest rates on cars are already sitting around that 15-16%. I think the car dealers will feel it first, and then, there'll be a few torn-up house contracts as a result of Tuesday's decision. Thank you. Sorry, mate. Super fast, Michael.
They're jumping out of trees to back the favourite Vauban in the Melbourne Cup, so we might join the Medding crowd, mate. All right, Bronwyn, yours. I'm with James Ashby. I think that they will put up interest rates on Tuesday for the sole reason that the Treasurer told them not to, and the new Commissioner wants to appear independent. Otherwise, all the arguments put forward against having an interest rate would prevail, but it just might be
0.15, not 0.25.
Oof, imagine. All right, thank you. Do appreciate it. All right, we will talk again soon. Quick break, back with more Royal Report about 5 and a bit minutes away.